I'm Alan Perelson. My day job's at Los Alamos in the theoretical biology group, but I've been associated with the Santa Fe Institute since 1978, both as an external faculty member and more recently science board member. And more to the topic, I've been a collaborator and friend of Stephanie Forrest, who's speaking tonight, for the last 25 years. Since some of you may not have been here yesterday, Steph gave a fantastic lecture and was introduced, and many accolades were presented about her. But I think because of limitations of time, people really didn't fully explore her background and her expertise. So just to quickly review for those of you who aren't here, Steph got her bachelor's degree in Santa Fe at St. John's, then went to the University of Michigan, where she got both a master's and PhD in computer science. Her thesis was done with John Holland, who's one of the founders of the Santa Fe Institute, and in fact gave the first Ulam lecture 20 years ago. After leaving the University of Michigan, she spent a few years in industry, working in the computer industry, and then decided to come back into academic life and came to Los Alamos and was a postdoc at the Center for Nonlinear Studies, which is an institution somewhat similar to SFI. It was at Los Alamos where she came as a postdoc that I first met her. We carpooled from Santa Fe, and Steph got interested in some of the work that I was doing in building computer models and mathematical models of the immune system. And I think that inspired some of the work that she will tell you about today. When she left Los Alamos in 1990, she joined the faculty at the University of New Mexico, where she advanced through the ranks. She's moved from assistant to associate to full professor. She was chair of the computer science department at UNM for 5 years. Then she became a Regents professor and more recently a distinguished professor, which I think is their highest rank, at the University of New Mexico. For the work in computer science that she's done, she's won numerous awards that weren't mentioned last night. Last night she spoke about developing computer systems that can automatically fix computer bugs. And for that work, she won a number of awards for best paper or set of papers. One of them was the Manfred Tall Award for Excellence in Software, which she won in 2009 with her colleagues for this work. It came with an award that must be special for computer science of 10,024 euros, which is basically not kilobyte, but kilobuck, for those of you who are familiar with that. Later that year, she won another award from the Genetic Programming and Evolvable Machines group called the Humes Gold Medal Award. This one came with a more substantial award of $5,000, again for sort of the best software for evolving software. And then in 2011, she won one of the top awards in computer science, something called the Alan Newell Award. And let me just read what this award is for. It's presented to an individual selected for career contributions that have breadth within computer science or that bridge computer science and other disciplines. This award is endowed by a prize of $10,000, and this year Anne won just by herself without her collaborators. In the award for Steph herself, you can all read the citation on the web, but it was for fundamental paradigm-changing contributions to computer science and biological sciences, most notably bringing together models of immune systems, automated diversity, and network epidemiology with significant impact on real computer and biological research and practice. And I think during the Ulam lectures, she will really bring to fore this marriage of biology and computer science. She also mentioned last night a lot of the economic impact of computer bugs and types of work done in computer science. And she was invited to the Davos Economic Summit last year in Switzerland, where she addressed world leaders and spoke about software and its biological design for software. So without further ado, I'm hoping Steph will tell us a little bit more about her work in biology and computer science. And, oh, there's one thing I forgot. In addition to working at the level of computer science, Steph, both directly and indirectly, has made some real contributions to biological research and in influenza in particular. One of her PhD students that I co-supervised with her, Derek Smith, at the time developed computer algorithms which were using in developing computer models for influenza infection. Those types of algorithms have now been developed, and Derek is a member of the World Health Organization committee that chooses the flu vaccine every year. And some of the work that Steph supervised and I supervised during his PhD thesis has evolved into using computer algorithms to help choose the strain of flu that goes into the vaccine every year. So a very practical application of the computer science. Steph, wherever you are, why don't you come on up and prevent me from saying more great things about you?
Well, Alan, thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm going to repeat a little bit. Alan introduced me to immunology primarily through a series of conversations in a carpool to Los Alamos, as he mentioned when I was a postdoc. And this carpool was really a central part in my intellectual life at Los Alamos. And he ultimately convinced me that immunology was more interesting than whatever it was I thought I was going to work on when I was there. And so then the next step was I had to learn some immunology. And so Alan gave me, I have to say, endless tutorials. It just took a long time for all the big words and all the different cell types to start sinking in. And then also one of the algorithms that I'm going to talk about tonight, he actually proposed. He really started me on this path of computer immune systems for security by proposing that negative selection could actually be turned into a computer algorithm. And so I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. And so as a result of this, we have collaborated for many years. We even have a patent together. And Alan, thank you for these many years of friendship and collaboration. So the goal of complexity science, in my view, I don't know if everyone agrees with me, is to discover the common principles underlying systems such as economies, immune systems, computer networks, social networks. And when we look at these networks, one common property that we see is the emergence of malicious behavior. And this behavior arises spontaneously in networks that have self-optimizing processes where the individual agents can optimize their own behavior and have a way, well, they're interested in doing as well as they can. They're self-interested, and they can somehow adjust their behavior over time. And so I have a few examples up here. An example from biology is this new disease that's being called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome that is in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia primarily. And this is the Egyptian tomb bat that they have traced the disease back to as being the most likely vector. And so we have these emerging diseases in populations. There's others that you've read about, SARS, for example, which is related to this one. We also, in social situations, we have this kind of persistent problem of bullying. And that's a form of malicious behavior that just kind of arises whenever we have selfish kids or selfish adults next to each other. And then finally, we have malicious hackers who have come along as the internet has evolved and matured. So have these malicious hackers. And the two things that I think really provide the environment for these kinds of malicious behaviors to arise are, as I mentioned before, nodes in these networks, self-interested actors, self-interested nodes in some way, and the ability to adapt their behavior to improve their payoff or fitness. Okay, so we're going to focus on the last of those, the malicious hackers, tonight. And anyone who reads the newspaper is aware that computer security is not very secure and might be getting worse every day, in spite of all this great work I'm going to tell you about tonight. And as our banking and socializing and personal lives have moved online, this is really much more than an academic problem. We're all living in this kind of continual cycle of innovative attack methods. And I know that you can't read everything on this little graphic on the side, but the colors indicate different generations in the evolution of computer attacks. And so those of you who are old enough to remember floppy disks will remember the floppy disk era when we had file infector and boot sector viruses that were passed around manually from computer to computer via these floppy disks. And then when we had the internet came of age and people got on the internet and started sending email and started using the web, we had the era of worms, as they're called, and you might remember Code Red and the Melissa viruses and some of these famous email viruses. So that was the second era. Then the third era really came about once money came to the internet. When the era of e-commerce really matured, we started having these malicious websites. And so in this era, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but if you click, the way these attacks work, if you go click on the wrong website, the act of clicking on the website can cause malicious software to be downloaded onto your computer. And finally, now that we have Facebook and Twitter and other social networking infrastructures, we have attacks that work at that level. So one thing that's happened during this era is that the terminology's changed. And we started out talking about viruses, and then we got worms, and then a few more things happened, and it wasn't really clear what the difference was between a virus and a worm. And now people just sort of threw up their hands, and it's all called malware. So malware is this encompassing term. And the thing about these attacks is that every time a new generation of attacks comes along, the computer security people scurry around, and we had antivirus companies that started, and then we had new companies that started in response to the worms. And so it's this kind of perpetual arms race between the attackers and the defenders. And many people in Washington, many funders, have this attitude, are frustrated with this. And they really just think that we should be able, if they put enough money into it and gave it to the right people, we could solve this problem once and for all. And my position is that that's unlikely to happen. I think we need to learn to live with it and manage it much in the way that biological systems do. Finally, another point about the cybersecurity problem is that there's a phenomenon called Moore's Law, which most of you have heard of, and this is this sort of relentless progression of computing technology. Every 18 months, we have double the computing power and roughly double the amount of memory, and networking speeds increase similarly. And so for many problems in computer science, graphics is a good example, other image processing algorithms, even machine learning, those are all problems that were not tractable 10 or 15 years ago that are tractable now, in large part because of the increased amount of computing power that we have. But in this particular problem that I'll be talking about tonight, that's not true. Every time there's another revolution of Moore's Law, it helps the attackers just as much as it helps the defenders. And that's one reason that I find this such a fascinating area to work in. In particular, current cybersecurity approaches aren't working very well. And one of the reasons they don't work very well is because they don't handle what are called zero-day attacks. And an example of a zero-day attack was the Stuxnet, I don't know what piece of malware, Stuxnet weapons, Stuxnet whatever, that attacked the Iranian nuclear facilities a couple of years ago. And and it was very interesting. Well, it was interesting for a lot of reasons, and I actually think it represents a moment in history that will be remembered and written about. But from our point of view, it was interesting because Stuxnet took advantage of at least 5 different so-called zero-day attacks. That is, attacks that exploited vulnerabilities that had never been publicized or known about before. And so we'll be talking about those as we go forward. Now, you might be wondering, I mean, everyone read about Stuxnet. By the way, the other interesting thing about Stuxnet is that it broke out of its boundaries. This seems so biological to me. my understanding is, I don't have personal knowledge of it, but the general feeling is that the people who wrote Stuxnet and who launched it didn't intend, thought that it would stay a secret. They didn't think that it would be discovered and see the light of day. And the way that it was discovered is because it broke out of these nuclear facilities, and it spread actually all around the world. And then the computer security companies started noticing this strange beast, this strange piece of malware. And that was actually how the existence of Stuxnet came to light. So that's just one example, and you might be wondering, how bad is it? There's a lot of scare stories in the newspapers. And I don't really like this marketing of fear. I think it's, it's a little bit hysterical. But the problem seems to me certainly very serious, and it's also notoriously hard to measure. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of data to give you an idea of the scope of the problem. So this is a study that was published a couple of years ago, and it shows the number of new vulnerabilities. So these are vulnerabilities that could lead to these zero-day attacks that were discovered every year for the past 10 years. And you can see there's just kind of this continual rise up to 9,000 in 2010. And that's a lot of vulnerabilities. Usually these vulnerabilities come about through what we in computer science call corner cases. That is, highly unusual events or states that the software gets into that that leaves a little opening that someone who understands the opening can write some malware to break through. And so this is my last slide of scary statistics. Symantec is a leading antivirus company, and they estimate the global cost. This is cyber crime, so this is a little different than the estimates I was giving you yesterday. But they estimate the global cost to be 1% of the US GDP, roughly. That's a lot of criminal activity that's going on the internet. And I was surprised to discover that Consumer Reports, good old Consumer Reports, that writes reviews of refrigerators and washing machines and cars, did a study on malware and concluded that in the year they did the study, at least one third of households had experienced some kind of malware event. So that's kind of like the old Harvard days. Look to the left, look to the right. One of you has been infected with malware, kind of thing. And I have to say, I don't myself have any way to assess these numbers, but these are just two kinds of studies that there are lots of these studies published, and I don't know any one of them you could poke holes in, but I think if you take them all together, they're troubling, and they suggest that we need some new approaches to this problem. So as I mentioned, there are many different kinds of attacks, and there's more being invented every day. But I thought it would be worth it to take a few minutes to consider some of the most common forms of attack and just tell you at a very high level how they work. And so the first one is this man-in-the-middle attack. And the way this works is, as you know, Alan works at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and Alan travels a lot. And Alan often travels to conferences that are in very lovely remote locations. So we'll just assume he's in the Bahamas or someplace like that, offshore. And Alan's working on some top secret project for Los Alamos, and he wants to upload some of his results or a paper or something to his colleagues in Los Alamos. And so he does this through the internet. It goes, through some routing, there's some networking. And along the way, I'm actually not working at the State Department this year. Like they said yesterday, I'm really working for a foreign government. Let's just suppose that. And so I'm interested in these top secret documents that Alan's uploading. And so I managed to intercept. Let's say he sends them over an unencrypted channel, or he thinks it's an encrypted channel, but it's not really working very well. And I can actually intercept these documents. And then I can do several things. I can make a copy of them, and then I could just send them on. And in that case, it would be very difficult for Los Alamos or for Alan to realize that they'd been compromised. I might also change them in some way, or I could just delete them, in which case probably everyone would know. But these are these so-called man-in-the-middle attacks, and there's many varieties of them, and that's one common form. A second common form of attack is the so-called botnet. These came along fairly recently. And I don't know if you can actually see the picture, but the idea is, so instead of getting Alan's top secrets, now we're going to assume that I'm in the business of delivering spam. So companies that want to send out spam messages come to me and hire me to send out spam messages to some number of customers. Not their customers, just some number of computers. And so the way I do this is quite clever. I first of all devise some kind of an attack, and I using automated means, break into, sort of compromise thousands of computers spread all over the world. And I don't actually do anything to the computer, so there's a good chance they won't notice. But I just install the so-called backdoor. Maybe I give myself a login account. That would be, an easy thing to think of. There's other more subtle things that you can do. And so then these machines have become my so-called bots. And you keep on, if you're a bot, you just keep using your machine. However, when someone comes to me and says, now I'd like you to send out spam to 100,000 people, I say, no problem. And I activate my tens of thousands of bots all around the world to send out these spam messages. So this has two advantages. So there's the little spam coming out of everybody's computer. This has two advantages. First of all, I have economies of scale. I can send out way more messages than I could send myself using my own network connection. And when the network operators notice, someone's eventually going to notice a lot of spam being sent from any single machine. And when that happens, they're going to go to the people who own the machines. They're not going to go to me. So I can sort of avoid detection. So those are two common kinds of attack. I didn't actually tell you how I would do the break-in. And so now we turn to what, for many, many years, I mean like maybe 30 years, was the most common form of attack. And it's called the buffer overflow. And to understand this attack, we have to do a little review from last night's lecture. So remember I told you about a program here written in C or some high-level language, and so the name of the program this time is going to be Victim, victim.c. It's going to get compiled into assembly code and then into object code, and then it's going to be loaded into the computer. But this this program is a little more complicated than the one I told you about last night, and it actually has, it sets aside, when it gets loaded into the memory, it sets aside a fixed amount of space to hold some data that it's expecting to read in when it's executed. So for example, if it was a program that processed email messages, this little buffer, as it's called, might be reserved to store the text of the subject line for the email message. And so now what happens is, so the program gets loaded in and executed. So it reads in the input it takes the input for this email message, and it takes the subject line. And now, if the subject line is longer, has more characters than the amount of space I've allocated in my buffer, this is just the main, the main memory area of the computer, then the subject line is going to actually spill over. So if you go back here, oops, the buffer was only supposed to go this long, but this one email message has an extremely long subject line, and the subject line doesn't just have characters like the subjects you write on your messages, but the subject line actually has little machine code instructions. And so when the buffer gets overflowed, it overwrites this return address pointer, which tells the computer which code to execute next when it's finished executing this little program. And so if you're clever and do it just right and know exactly how this buffer's laid out, you can overwrite the return address with an instruction that says, jump to some other program. And if that program happens to be the attacker's program, then that program gets executed with the privileges of the original program. Okay, so this form of attack, as I mentioned, is extremely common. It's still extremely common. And it's actually been around. It's been known about since the early 1970s. And one thing I want to say is that the reason this attack can work is because of our early computer pioneers who we revere so much, John von Neumann and his friends who invented the stored program computer. And so the thing that happens in this attack is that the instructions get treated as data. They get read in as data when you process this subject line, and then they later get executed. And that has given us a lot of power in computing. That's one reason computers work so well, but it has also made computers vulnerable to this kind of attack. Okay, so these are just 3 examples of how malware can gain control of someone else's computer. And generally what happens is every time a new one of these attacks is devised or a new variation of it is devised, the computer security community takes a look at it, they reverse engineer it, and then they they figure out, invent a method for coping with this new method of attack. And usually that new method involves a so-called patch, a bug fix, that gets distributed to all of the customers. And so the problem with this is it doesn't scale. It means for every new kind of attack, some human has to try to understand it, or maybe you could imagine my automated software fixing it automatically. But even so, it's not a very scalable way to go about the problem. And before I start telling you how I think we should attack the problem, I just want to tell you how computer security thinks about security. So there are 3 main properties that we care about for computers. We care about confidentiality, and that's the idea that my data, if I want it to be kept private, should be kept private. That one has been in the news a lot lately. We care about integrity. So integrity would have been if I took interfered with Alan's transmission and changed the data. So we want the information that we store to remain in the state that it was when we stored it and not be changed out from under us. And the final thing is availability. We want our computers and our information to be available anytime we want to get to them. And the way that computer security people technically or typically go about ensuring these 3 properties is by writing rules or policies that they expect either an organization or a piece of software to obey. And these rules or policies often get translated into computer programs, and then they get loaded onto the computer, and that's supposed to enforce these 3 properties. And of course, what happens is that the people don't do a very good job of writing the rules, and these corner cases I talked about are problematic. Or when the rules get translated into software, the programmers make mistakes. We talked last time about how common that is. Or when even if the program's correct and the policy's correct, if it gets loaded onto a computer that has configuration problems, then all those policies might not provide the guarantees that the authors think. And so this is kind of a top-down, heavy-handed way to go about security, and it doesn't adjust very well to changes. And so one thing about the computing world is it's always changing. There's always a new set of libraries or a new piece of hardware. And those of you with smartphones, there's always a new app to be downloaded. And so it makes it very hard in that environment to use this strategy. So my idea, inspired largely by Alan, was to notice that the problem the immune system solves for the body is essentially the same problem that we would like our cybersecurity systems to solve for our computers. And in particular, immune systems do detect novel pathogens, diseases you've never been exposed to. You might get sick, but you eventually can get rid of the infection under most circumstances. And when it notices one of these infections, when your immune system does, it can figure out how to get rid of it, and then it can get rid of it automatically. And usually it can get rid of it in time to save your life before so much harm is done to your body that you can't survive. And what we would like computer security to do is the same thing. We would like it to be able to detect unauthorized use of computers, like I just told you about, malware, and ideally, we're really a long ways from this, is respond automatically and clean up those infected computers on their own. And in fact, I like to argue to my computer security friends that biology is the science of security. It's the true science of security in the sense that organisms have evolved in this adversarial environment for eons, and they've had to contend with these attacks on themselves in competition right from the beginning. And as a result, they've evolved these just amazingly elaborate, clever, complex, wonderful defense systems. And a picture of that is this, an example is this little immune cell right here that is actually eating, attacking, and digesting bacteria. These little things here are bacteria. And there's all kinds of mechanisms like that. One of the reasons that I'm so interested in the immune system is I think that, or in biological defense systems, is because they really have to cope with very difficult challenges, like autoimmunity, deception, and mimicry. So here's just one example out of many, but it's one of my favorite examples. This is a mimicry attack. So this is an ant right here, and the ant has been infected by a parasite. And the parasite has the effect on the ant of making this part of its body resemble the berries that the ant is living amongst. And so the effect of that is that birds who come to eat the berries might be confused and might instead eat the ant instead of the berry. And when they do that, they'll digest the eggs from the parasite and fly to wherever they fly. And when they defecate, the parasite eggs will be spread to a new location. And so I thought that was a beautiful example when I discovered it. There are many other similar examples. And I can tell you that our computer security systems are a long ways from being able to defend against this kind of attack. Defense in depth is a popular concept in cybersecurity. People talk a lot about defense in depth. And another reason why I like biology is because it exemplifies this strategy. So biological systems have layers of defense. They have several defense and repair mechanisms that exist inside every cell in your body. And I'm not going to talk about those tonight, but they're important. And they're always an area that I've intended to go work on in my research and haven't gotten to. Then there's quite a few generic responses, things like homeostasis that keep the body sort of monitors its own temperature or pH, whatever it's monitoring, and makes little adjustments that are essentially not noticeable by the organism that keeps it within normal operating tolerances. And that's an important mechanism, and there's several other related ones like that. It also uses this principle of diversity, which has been one of my favorites. So the idea of diversity, my interpretation of diversity, is that it confers population-level robustness. So even if a particular individual is susceptible to a disease or an attack of some sort, if there's diversity in the population, there's a good chance that some of the individuals in the population will survive the attack and the species will live on. And then finally, in vertebrates, there's this beautiful defense system that seems to have evolved especially to defend against pathogens called the immune system. So here is a very simple biological concept, this concept of diversity, that is directly relevant to our computer security problem. And I like to argue that our cyber infrastructure looks like this field of corn. It's essentially a monoculture in the sense that most of us in the room either have Windows PCs running some flavor of Windows, or we now have, some of us have Macs running the Mac OS. But we all use the same email readers and the same software. And so there's this important homogeneity or uniformity. And that's good economically, right? Economies of scale are good. That's what lets computer companies make money. But it also provides a source of vulnerability to replicated kinds of attacks. And so just like, I don't know, a little weevil, I don't know what kind of bugs attack corn, but whatever kind of bug attacks corn, once one bug finds one ear of corn to eat, then its descendants can eat its way through an entire field or state that's planted with the same crop. So what we would like to do is take this idea. We were interested in taking this idea and thinking about how to apply it to computing. So what we wanted to do was have a way, sorry, this little microphone is falling off. Okay. We wanted to have a way to be able to introduce diversity into the computing infrastructure in a way that wouldn't disturb the users, but would be highly likely to prevent attacks or disrupt attacks. And that's a bit of a trick. The idea is really simple. I thought it was a great idea. And the details turn out to be very intricate. And so I'm just going to give you one example. There's several different ways that you might do this. This particular method has now actually made it into most vendor-supplied operating systems. So most of you are running computers that uses this so-called address space randomization. And so here's this little cartoon of the main memory of the computer from a few slides ago. And let's suppose when you, this right here is all the different programs. So I was only telling you about one program. There's lots of other programs, there's data, and it's all laid out in memory in this certain way. But now imagine that the next time you run this program, the memory is laid out in a completely different way. And so this little jump instruction, if it jumped you into this code the first time, and maybe that attack succeeded, the next time it's not going to work, or on the next computer it's not going to work, because the attack code won't be located in the same place. And that's, it's a very simple idea. It's actually quite tricky to implement and get it right. But most of the operating system companies have become convinced that it's a good form of defense. Doesn't defend against everything, but it's a good first start. Now we're going to turn to a more complex system, the immune system. And especially with Alan in the room, I'm only going to give you the 50,000-foot view, cartoon view of how the body defends itself against foreign pathogens. And by pathogens, I mean viruses, bacteria, and even parasites. And the thing about these particular attackers is that once they have managed to get inside your body or someone's body, some organism, they typically start replicating. And the defense system then has this time constraint that it has to be able to notice that it's been infected and eliminate the infection before there's so many copies of it that it has really prevented the body from functioning. And the way the immune system does this is my little cartoon. Imagine this is one of these attacking pathogens, and it has gotten into your body, and it turns out throughout your body you have a whole set of detectors whose primary job is to notice invading foreign material. And these cells called these detectors are cells. They're called lymphocytes. You may have heard of T cells or B cells. Those are both examples of them. And they have these these unique receptors. Each of them is made a little bit differently, so they each have a different pattern of receptors on their surface. And the idea is that collectively, the repertoire will have enough diversity in it that at least one of these detectors will recognize, that is, it will be able to bind, be complementary and bind to the pattern on the surface of the infecting pathogen. And once that happens, we call that binding process recognition. There's a little picture, kind of a picture next, one step towards reality of what it actually looks like right there. This is the detector, and this is the cell that's presenting some of the antigen. And once that recognition event happens, then there's a whole cascade of events that takes place depending on the particular kind of infection it is that leads to the pathogen being eliminated. Okay, so this is a very clever, very wonderful system. It's distributed throughout your body, and these cells, for the most part, work autonomously. They're independent and decentralized. There are also molecules, many classes of important molecules that are secreted by these cells. We're not going to talk about those tonight. And two final things to note. It's important that these receptors be fairly specific, because if they are general and can bind to all kinds of different patterns, then there's a high probability that one of the detectors, one of the lymphocytes, will bind to some of the normal cells in the body and lead to an autoimmune reaction. And we know autoimmunity happens. It's a common reason for, a common explanation for many diseases. And so that's an indication that this recognition problem is what we would say in computer science, non-trivial. Okay, so these recognizers have to be specific, and this problem of distinguishing self from non-self is one of the jobs the immune system has to do. The other thing the immune system does is when it's confronted with a pattern that it doesn't recognize very well, it actually uses a process that looks a lot like the genetic algorithm I talked about yesterday. It looks a lot like Darwinian evolution, except without crossover. And in a few generations, a few days, it evolves a set of detectors that recognize that particular pattern very, very closely. And that process is known as affinity maturation. And after that happens, some of those cells become memory cells. And those memory cells then can respond much more aggressively if you're ever infected with the same pathogen again. And so that's why it is that some diseases like measles, you can only get once. So how do we actually take that story and turn it into computer security? We use this thing that I like to, this idea that I like to refer to as the fundamental modeling abstraction. And Alan mentioned this work, this other modeling work that we've done with Derek Smith and some other projects I've done, and all those projects use the same abstraction. So the idea is that these receptors on the surfaces of cells that are just molecules, and we abstract away all the detail about those molecules, and we represent them just as a string of zeros and ones. And so this is the detector cell, and then we might have the antigen right here being presented by the presenting cell. And then this binding operation that I talked about for cells, we can actually model that as just matching, string matching between two different kinds of strings. And in computer science, we have a lot of ideas about how to do string matching. One simple idea is just to use Hamming, what's called Hamming distance, which is just to walk down the string and count up the positions at which the two strings match. And in this example, there's a pretty good match. So once we've made that abstraction, then we can build our little artificial immune systems simply by generating sets of bit strings and finding patterns for them to match against. And we can actually mimic a lot of the mechanisms of the adaptive immune system. Okay, so we had done a lot of modeling of the immune system, and then actually what happened is I got a job at the University of New Mexico in a computer science department, and I needed to convince them that I was a real computer scientist. So I had to solve a real computer science problem. And so I became interested in this idea of building a digital immune system. And to do that, you'd have to have several things. The first thing you might want to have is something like a non-specific response. Things like the skin and the mucous membranes. There are many sort of generic defense mechanisms in your body. And we also, in computers, we have things like firewalls and access control lists and all kinds of basic permissions built in. Even the basic virtual machine multitasking model of computing can be thought of as a kind of defense. So those are non-specific defenses. But the great thing about the immune system is if that fails, it has this backup system called the adaptive response. And that's the one that I just told you about. And so if we were going to do that to attack malware or detect malware, we would have to first of all figure out what we mean by self and how to generate detectors, what the attack patterns are going to, what space they live in. Are they network packets, or are they patterns of function calls or arguments of function calls? I mean, there's a zillion things that you might do. And then we have to think about how to process the patterns, and if we're going to do the whole thing, we have to have learning and memory. So actually, the hardest part of this turned out to be thinking about defining self. And if you think about it, we needed a definition of self that could tolerate all the things that people do to computers, like load in new software or reboot their reboot into a totally different operating system, or edit files, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that system administrators do the weirdest, most anomalous things to computers. But they, of course, are the ones we wanted to convince that this approach would be a good idea. So we had to make sure that we thought about that. Another problem in the computer is that it's not so clear what the periphery is. You know, it's pretty clear in your body where the body stops and the environment starts, relatively clear. But in computers, it's a little hard to know where your computer stops and where the rest of the environment takes off. And especially that's true, cloud computing has just made that problem even harder. All right, and then in addition to having this response, in the long run, we would also like to have an automated response to be able to get rid of the problem once we've detected it. And then finally, I added this little item because people always ask me about it. We would like to have a way to protect the immune system itself. So before I tell you how to do that, I just want to come back to these zero-day attacks and convince you that they're a real problem. So in the past few, well, really Stuxnet. Stuxnet is a famous one I talked about. I mentioned 5 different zero-day vulnerabilities that it took advantage of. And in the end, it infected 1.5 million hosts around the world. So that was a pretty impressive infection, especially considering that most of it was accidental. And then this botnet, one of the very famous botnets called Conficker, infected over 450,000 machines. So this is really different than the old days of these floppy disks that maybe went around an office or something. This is a serious problem. And it turns out actually that there's a market. There's now a market for these zero-day attacks. And although I have not verified this personally, some of the accounts I've read claim that some of these attacks sell for as much as $500,000. That's a lot of money. And the thing, I just want to remind you that the thing about these zero-day attacks is that virus scanners and I don't know if you've heard of Snort. There's a variety of these kind of signature-based intrusion detection systems. We'll talk about that on the next slide. They are not going to be very helpful against these zero-day attacks. I mean, they might every now and then accidentally catch one, but in general, if you have this theory that you're going to wait to see the attack and then you're going to engineer the defense against it, you're always going to be one step behind. So after these virus products had been around for a while, people had the idea of an intrusion detection system, because that's really what the immune system is, right? It detects intrusions to the body. And so the way this looks in computers, you have a computer here. This is your monitored system that we're going to monitor for intrusions. And you have to identify some data stream. This is the thing that I was saying is like defining self. So you have some data stream that an external monitor can watch and collect data on. So that's we're showing that here. That whatever the data that we're watching, we'll talk more about that in a second, comes off the machine, we take a look at it, and then we feed it into a model. And the model is supposed to tell us whether or not that's normal behavior or whether there's an attack going on. So everything rests on the model to look at the data and decide whether or not the system is under attack. And normally the way these intrusion detection systems work is that a programmer over here writes down these so-called signatures for each attack. And that's a little bit like having an immune system that protects you only against diseases that you've been vaccinated against. So it's good, especially serious diseases that we know about, but it leaves you pretty vulnerable to the new one that's just showing up in that Egyptian tomb bat. So the strategy the immune system uses is to have this model be built automatically, and to have it work on the principle of anomaly detection. That is, it's going to notice what the normal patterns are for the body, and when something unusual comes along, it's going to treat that as dangerous or foreign, and it's going to attack it. And so that's the idea that we want to use. And actually, I should say, the immune system also uses these signatures, because once it's learned what these patterns are, it saves them, and then it can bring them out. So it actually has both of those abilities. So I'm talking about this example, even though it's kind of old by now. This is a system that my student, Stephen Hoffmeyer, built for his dissertation because it has the most amount of immunology in it. And it was a network, it was a kind of a network intrusion detection system. It was very innovative at the time. The idea was, you can tell that it was a little while ago because you can see the pictures of the computers are kind of old. Anyway, so we have a bunch of computers on what's called a local area network. And the local area network is outlined here in, it's supposed to be yellow. Looks kind of mustard colored on the screen. And the computers, as you know, talk to each other. And it turns out that most computers talk to very few other computers over very limited, what are called services, using a very small number of programs. So a service might be HTTP, which handles your web requests, or STMP, which handles your email, but a very few number of those programs that we want to communicate with. And the computers, let's see, what else do I have to talk about the computer? Each computer has a unique address. This is the so-called IP address. And it's represented as this series of 4 numbers, which is kind of a convention. And the idea is that we're going to make a little immune system, a detector set, for each one of these computers. And actually, we're not going to make it. We're going to let the computer build its own and evolve its own in the network in the environment of the network packets. Okay, and by the way, local computers on a local area network, some of them at least tend to talk to outside computers, so we have to be able to handle those as well. And the attacks could come either from inside the network or from outside. So our definition of self in this example, what one of these detectors is going to represent is one connection between a computer A and computer B. And so the first set of the bits is going to code for the source IP address, where the connection is coming from. And the next set of bits is going to code for the destination, the address where the where the connection is going to be going to. And the third one is going to be the port, the kind of program, which kind of program we want the receiving computer to use to understand the network communication. I'm simplifying, by the way, a lot of the details about modern networking. I apologize. Okay, so how did this actually work? Well, going back to our fundamental modeling and abstraction, what we would do is generate these detectors. We would actually generate them, each computer would generate them randomly, and then we would let them live in the environment of the network, and it would match all the connections, incoming connections. And so this is a picture of it was actually only the SYN packets, only the packets that initiated the connection that we looked at. And that made it possible for us to do this in real time, which was important. And then we had to define a matching rule. Let's just assume that the one we used is very close to this Hamming distance thing I said before. So we have our detector, which we generated randomly. We have some network connections. And then we just go through and count up the ones and zeros and see how many positions it matches at. And then we define a threshold. And I think in these experiments, if I'm remembering, we had about 100 detectors on each computer. And these detectors, it turned out through a few tricks, were 49 bits long. And we defined a match to be about, it was roughly 2/3 of the bits had to match in order for us to declare that that was an anomalous packet. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, good, because I can't really see you anyway. I kind of like this. You know, when I lecture in class, of course, people get their hand up all the time and interrupt me. This is kind of nice. I don't have to, I can just keep rolling. Okay, so I just want to focus on one of these detectors, but just remember that we had a whole set of computers, and each computer had a collection of about 100 of these detectors. And we would randomly generate them. This is not unlike, this is taking a few liberties, but a reasonable approximation of how the immune system generates its receptors. And then we would let the detector live, as I said, in the environment of the network and just watch the network traffic. And if it matched anything in the first 2 days was our default value, then we would kill it off. And so the idea was we wanted to train these detectors. We wanted a set of detectors that was not autoimmune, that didn't match with self. And so we were training it on the normal behavior of the network. And it turns out that this little operation, this was the one that Alan suggested, is very close to an immune system mechanism known as negative selection. And if it did match anything, we killed it off, and then we just right away generated another one. Yeah? I'm sorry, let me just take that at the end, okay? I think that's more technical than most of the audience. Okay, but I will be happy to answer that question. I just couldn't quite hear it, and I think it's gonna, I have to explain too much networking to everyone else to answer that. So let me just plunge on. But one answer is we actually looked at both incoming and outgoing connections. I don't know if that's the question you were asking, but that's one additional piece of information. Okay, so if it actually survived this negative selection, then we declared it to be a mature so-called naive detector, and we then put it to work and said, okay, go forth and detect anomalous network traffic. And if it failed at that job, if it just didn't, let's say it doesn't match anything, then after a longer period of time, normally about a week, we would kill it off. And that is also not unlike what the immune system does. So my student actually built this system first and tried it out and ran it. And it turned out to have a huge number of what we call false positives, a lot of autoimmune reactions. And because he wanted to graduate with his PhD, he immediately got very clever about how to fix it up. And he started inventing these new mechanisms. And so one mechanism was to say, well, these naive detectors, they're too quick off the mark. They have a hair trigger, and they're reacting to everything. So what we'll do is give it a threshold and say that it has to match a fixed number, say 10, of these anomalous packets within some period of time. So we call that the activation threshold. And if it exceeded this activation threshold, then we would say the detector had been activated. And again, this was the next little step, and then we were going to send an alarm to the system administrator. That still gave us too many false positives. It was a little better, but we were now in this realm of research, and I just really want to communicate what it's like when we try out these things. This is exploratory research. We actually don't know if it's going to work or not ahead of time. We kind of have this, it should work. It works for the immune system. Dang it, if I just push hard enough, I should be able to get it to work. But there's always that big question mark hanging out there. And when it's a student who's doing his dissertation or her dissertation, there's even more drama. Okay, so then Steve went away and scratched his head, and he added a few more mechanisms. And the next mechanism is what in immunology is called a second signal. And so he required in our case, it was a system administrator to confirm that this was actually an anomalous event. You can imagine other automated ways of doing it. And in the immune system, it's a helper T cell that does that. And so when we put all that together, we actually got great results. That was finally enough. And in the end, it was able to detect all of the standard network attacks of the day. We deployed it in our department on our local area network for a while, and it detected many interesting things, many unusual behaviors, including one of the teaching assistants who was port scanning his professor's machine. And it was sort of humorous who the professor was. That was part of the humor. Okay, so what we learned out of all this was that autoimmunity is important and requires a lot of mechanisms. And it was actually surprising how many of these mechanisms that had correlations in the immune system, how many of those were really required. And we also, this cross-reactivity idea that was sort of sloppy matching with a threshold, that was one of the tricks that made it possible for us to run this thing in real time with a reasonable number of detectors. Okay, so this work and some of the other projects we did then had an amazing amount of impact, more than I could have ever imagined. And it turned out that a system that one of my other students built that he got working sooner than this one was the first, it's generally credited as being the first practical anomaly intrusion detection system. That one actually used system calls. My student Steve, the one who did that work, went on and formed a company that made a product that sold an intrusion detection system called Primary Response that worked very well. We couldn't outcompete Cisco sort of on market share, but technically it was better. And then we also investigated a lot of these graduated and automated responses, and one of our ideas there got picked up by Hewlett-Packard and turned into a product they called their Virus Throttle. We did a lot of other things, and I can see I'm running a little short of time, so I'm not going to tell you about this other one, but another project we did, we took this idea of negative representations, and you could think about these negative detectors as providing sort of a negative image of the pattern of self. It's kind of a negative representation of self, not unlike this famous urn picture that shows, you know, where you have the figure ground issue. And so we used that idea to develop some very unusual privacy-preserving data representation techniques. That work has not had as big an impact, but maybe it will now that we've learned all about the problems with the regular encryption. I don't know. Okay. So you might be wondering, if you're skeptical, do we really need this immunological perspective? Because a lot of these ideas, these anomaly intrusion detection systems are now out there in computer security. No one calls them immunology. We have address space randomization. No one calls that immunology. So why do we need them? And so I want to close, just this is the last little part of this talk, by telling you this fun anecdote. I have a collaborator named Jed Crandall down at UNM. He's quite a bit younger than I am, and in fact, I hired him when I was chair. So you can imagine, I was technically his boss. And he's a hardcore systems security, operating systems, networking, computer architecture kind of guy. And we go out to lunch a lot. We're both interested in computer security. And he was always very polite, probably because I was his chair. And listening to me talking about all this, biobabble, and he never really believed it very much. He was very, very skeptical, and but we kept talking, and we've always liked each other. Anyway, so he came to me one day about a year ago, maybe a little more now, and he was kind of shuffling, and hunched over, and he said, "I really would like to talk to you about immunology," and I'm immediately thinking, okay, he or someone in his family has some terrible disease or something. Jed's never going to be interested in immunology. And he says, well, I'm not liking it very much, but I'm doing this work on internet censorship. And I think what I'm seeing, I can only explain by these ideas about immunology. And so I just want to close out the talk by telling you a little bit about how that goes. So what he's interested in, he studies China a lot, but the ideas are pretty general. And he's interested in what information is China blocking? Where is it being blocked? It's not always being blocked on the outside border, like people, some of the articles might tell you. When is it being blocked, and how is it being blocked? And so his research is really to define develop the software tools to let him answer these questions sitting in New Mexico, not being inside China. And they're very sophisticated and fancy. And so he's done a number of case studies. He's looked at local sites, local networks to see what's being censored. By the way, Wendy's does a lot more censoring and has their networks shut down a lot more than our Albuquerque Police Department. That was an interesting discovery. He's looked at some of the Chinese chat programs. And finally, he's looked at the Chinese version of Twitter, which is called Weibo. And it turns out there's several layers of these attacks. The first layer, these are used in the chat programs, and they're also used in Weibo, are these keyword blacklists. And so he spent a lot of effort trying to figure out what keywords were on the blacklist, coming up with funny examples, and all of that. Like Tiananmen Square might be a blacklisted kind of the Chinese characters for that. And so that's kind of the first level. And then the people who wanted to communicate, so let's say about Tiananmen Square without being censored, they figured out a way around it, which Jed refers to as a neologism. And so you can see here, so Wukon is going to feature in this next little story we tell. Wukon is a place in China, and the character for Wukon looks like this. Jed, by the way, while he's been an assistant professor, has also been taking Chinese classes. And this is another character. This word, I'm not sure what it means, but the character looks a lot like Wukon. So when people wanted to talk about Wukon, they would just send this character. And everyone that was sort of in the in-group would know that it was referring to this sort of unmentionable word. So that's sort of the second level. And then level 3 are these dynamics, and it seems like it's a very adaptive process. And I'm not going to go through this in gory detail, but this, a couple of years ago in Wukon, which is a province or a town someplace in China, there were a lot of protests. And people were blogging about these protests. And so this is time, and this is a log scale that lets you know how many of these posts, these Weibo posts, mention this particular term, Wukon. And so you can see that it goes way up when these protests first start. Then it kind of dies off and bounces around. And then at some point in here, someone was killed. The authorities killed someone, and that made a lot of news and got a lot of people upset, and so you could see that it spiked up even more. And remember, this is a logarithmic scale. And then it suddenly plunges. But it turns out that this term right here, which is shown in red, the frequency of that, took off right about then. And so what happened is when the Chinese started censoring the one term, the people who were communicating used the other. And so there's several things to notice. It's threshold based, right? They were tolerating a little bit of this talk for quite a while, but eventually it crossed a threshold where the censors decided to shut it down. And then there was a peaceful resolution to this particular situation that happened right in here. And so after that, the Chinese quit censoring, and so it went up again, and then it kind of died off. And so this illustrates, Jed thinks this is very kind of a typical example, and that the censorship is, first of all, so how did he do this? I forgot to tell you that. How did he do this? Well, all the Weibo posts are public, right? Just like Twitter. So he downloaded them. And he has a large collection of these things that use up a lot of space, a lot of storage space in our department. But I'm not chair anymore, so I don't have to worry about that problem. Anyway, so what he has concluded about censorship with many of these little stories and observations is that, first of all, it's decentralized. It's not all happening in one place, and that it's multi-level. It's defense in depth. First there's keyword blocking, then these neologisms get used, and it's adaptive. So when a new thing comes along and suddenly becomes sensitive, like this Wukon, the system can respond. And it takes a little while, and it tolerates a little bit of noise, but eventually it blocks it. And so there's this idea of a graduated response, which we've used a lot in our own work. It's robust to small amounts of noise. And when I was talking to him about it, I said, well, obviously the next step is the censors are going to figure out a way to detect these neologisms. And then we'll have cross-reactive defenses, just like the immune system. So I think that's a nice illustration. And you might be thinking, well, this isn't so good because we think censorship is bad. But just remember, it all depends on which side of the fence you're on. And so if you're the Chinese, this is just a way of defending, keeping out these bad posts. And so it's interesting to me that it's evolved to this kind of complex state that looks a lot like the immune system. Okay, so to sum up, malware attacks are prevalent, and they use a lot of very clever tricks, some of which I showed you. We can use biology in various ways. We can use diversity to get system-level robustness and disrupt these replicated forms of attacks, and that technology is out there. At least one form of it is out there. There are many other forms we could do. And we can use immunology both for security, like in this intrusion detection sense, and what I didn't get to tell you about is also for protecting privacy using these negative representations. So that's good news. That's the good news. However, if we go back to this picture that we looked at last night, we might have a lot of questions. Like, where should we, even if we have these mechanisms, these cute technical mechanisms, where should we deploy them? What impact will they have? You know, if I just turn one of these things loose, it was okay when Steve did his dissertation just to do it in my little department. We were all friends and everyone let us do it. But if we were going to turn it loose in this world, what impact would it have? And what are the actual economic incentives that are driving both the malware and the defenses? And it's very, very costly to do sort of empirical studies, you know, just try something out in this world. And so the topic of the next lecture tomorrow is going to be how to build believable models that we can use to start thinking about these human factors that I've really completely ignored so far. So things like incentives, human incentives, economics, and increasingly over the past, just the past couple of years, as we've seen, politics are starting to really come into this world and have a large influence on the kinds of solutions that, that are possible and considered usable. And so we will talk about that next time. First we'll talk about modeling, and then we'll talk about one particular kind of model that uses ideas from biology, and then we'll come back to this question of policies and incentives and talk about how we can start thinking about those. So thank you very much. And if,
Time for some questions? Right up front.
I have a few questions. One is more technical
okay.
than the other.
Definitely here.
Okay. Would you like to hear the more technical
Sure.
or the
Sure.
more
I just, yep, and I'll even get, yep.
meta
I don't care.
cybersecurity? Okay.
I don't care.
The
Pick your
technical
favorite, and then we'll see what everyone
they're
else
both,
wants to.
is what do you feel is the future of generic attack techniques, even with return-oriented programming in this world where modern memory allocators, even custom,
Right.
have heap chunk headers protected by some form of canary, and all classic stack-based buffer overflows are similarly protected with the proliferation of various pointer leak techniques to break, ASLR for other
Right,
people.
yeah, that's
address space
yeah,
allocation.
I got it.
Which that she
I
talked
got,
about.
I got the question. Let me,
Okay.
can I answer it?
Yes,
So,
please.
let me just sort of translate for the audience.
Right.
So this account that I gave of the buffer overflow attack, since that time, well, first of all, there have been a number of different methods. She mentioned canaries. There's a lot of other methods that have been developed to defeat that particular kind of attack. But that same strategy, these return to libc and return-oriented programming attacks, they're basically the same idea. They're just more sophisticated forms of it. And in fact, there are other kinds of diversification, like instruction set randomization, that would be helpful against those kinds of attack. But I would classify that particular world of these little memory overflow kinds of attacks as having its own little arms race with the defenders.
I see. So you think that we should start formally considering proliferation of like return to libc variation?
Yeah, well, actually, what I really think is that automatically evolving attacks is not going to be that hard. Oh, I think she was just asking me whether I think these more sophisticated forms of memory attacks are enough of a problem that we really need to think about them widely. And I think, yes, they are, and I think we're shutting down. I mean, it's a lot harder now to do those attacks than it was when they were invented. But I also think, in addition to that, that it's not going to be that long before we start seeing more kinds of automatically evolving forms of attack.
Isn't that what the ANS was doing anyway for what's the name, Rick Carola?
The ANS.
I mean the NAS.
The NSA. Ah, I was wondering how long it was going to take to get to the NSA.
Wasn't that exactly what they were doing before, what's his name, we allowed anyway?
Well, the NSA has done a lot of things, and I will tell you that most of the things they've done I don't know about. And the most recent thing that came out that I think you might be referring to are these attacks on encryption systems. And these particular attacks that I was talking about today are not attacks on encryption mechanisms. So that's a different set of problems. And yes, the crypto community, I'm sure, is very busy right now responding to that information.
All right, one quick question before I gotta go anyway. So if the port doesn't detect the source, does it go back to the original destination?
If the port doesn't detect the source,
Yes. Does it repeat back? Does it go back to the original point of entry?
no, the way it happens is if I'm a computer and I want to talk to you, my computer sends to you one of these so-called SYN packets. And it basically says, I would like to talk to you. I'd like to establish a connection, at least for this particular way of communicating. And then if you get my packet and your computer's up and that port is active and all those things, then you send back to me an acknowledgement message. And then actually I send you a third message. So it's a three-way handshake. And then after that, the connection is considered to be open and the packets just flow. Okay.
Back.
Well, that's people say they do a lot. I mean, that's the common belief, and I guess they have an advantage in the sense that they can buy computers and they can buy software and they can study the system that they want to attack, and they also have an advantage in the sense that as a defender, I have to defend against all possible attacks, ideally, right? Because I don't know which kind of attack might come to me. But as an attacker, you only have to find one weakness in my computer. So in that sense, I think the problem is easier for the attacker.
The biological analogy is quite compelling for natural kinds of phenomena. But what we see in computer systems are engineered attacks. And biological systems are not very good against engineered attacks like sarin gas or
Right.
various poisons that come about. So how do we defend against those engineered attacks using biological ideas?
Okay, so Bob is a friend of mine, so I'm going to make a really snotty reply. Okay? That, I claim, is the argument for intelligent design. And that's basically saying that the intelligent adversary, the engineer, is smarter than nature. And I just don't buy it. In the case of, in the general situation, I don't buy it. In the case of that you mentioned, those molecular kinds of attacks, the immune system is not evolved to handle at all. It's not interested in them. And maybe Alan would want to say something more about that. But I think most engineers think that they're smarter than nature, and in the long run, I don't think that's true. And when we have computer security systems that are as sophisticated as our biological defense systems, which even though they can't defend against sarin gas, they can defend against a lot of other stuff, then I'll sit down and have that conversation with you again.
If one looks
But like
over,
I said, Bob is a friend of mine, so.
if one looks over evolutionary time, biological systems have evolved to protect against all sorts of toxins, but it may take them tens of thousands of years to evolve mechanisms doing that. So what you're asking, is something that's very immediate. But if we look at all sorts of plant and bacterial toxins, the immune system has discovered ways of fighting against them.
So, one way of thinking about the biological analogy with the immune system is to think about
That's a great question. Did everyone hear it? Okay, so the observation is that over time, biological systems have actually incorporated a lot of foreign material. Things that used to be enemies are now, incorporated into our genomes, and we use them for good purpose. And so, is there anything like that in the computer security immunology analogy? And I would like to think about that question. I can't think of an example right off the bat. It's an intriguing suggestion. And I can't think of an example right off the bat that speaks to that particular question, but
Okay. It's
I'll
getting
think about
late.
it.
Let's just do one more question, and then I guess anyone who has burning questions can come up and talk to Stephanie separately. This last one back here. And speak loudly. I don't want to run up. Did everyone hear that? Okay, I think there were some no's there. Okay, so I will reformulate the question in a way that I can answer it. So the idea is that in sociology, and I think most of us would agree, that our self isn't just the physical stuff that the immune system has evolved to protect against, but there's social norms and, I don't know, a bunch of other things that he mentioned that sort of are at a different level and not really addressed by the natural immune system. And do I have any ideas about how that's going to work in software? And I guess I would say that that's part of why I'm spending this year in Washington, because I've realized that we have these technical solutions that by themselves are actually very good. But there's major questions about how to get them distributed. There's incentive questions. Why do individual users feel so little incentive to secure their own computers? They don't know how to, but a lot of it is they're not willing to spend money to do that. So why is it, and what is it that we would have to change? So I think those questions are all coming up, and I don't know how well addressed they will be by the natural immune system analogy. I think that's a good observation. And it's somewhat what I'm going to try to address tomorrow, if you want to drive up from Albuquerque again. Okay, well, let's all thank Stephanie for a marvelous talk.